Hi, in this lecture, we're going to cover the race to space. We're going to cover up until the early 2000s of space exploration, and then we'll talk a little bit about the benefits of the space program. I'm not going to go into modern space exploration. There just is too much of it. Um, but on your own, if you want to concentrate on different areas of space exploration taking place now, we have sent Laddie up a couple of years ago to the moon to do studies of the moon. The Chinese have also sent probes up into space and have also sent men into space. And you can also look into the space exploration of Saturn, uh, Jupiter. We've looked at different comets, different asteroids, and we've also sent even more probes to the moon. Okay, so let's talk about the space race. In 1957, on October 4th, the Soviet Union sent into space Sputnik. Sputnik was about the size of a basketball. It weighed about 183 pounds, and it orbited 3 times at 98 minutes for each orbit. It took an elliptical path. This did pass over the United States, and the American people were pretty upset. Here we have a probe from the Soviet Union. It's going to go ahead and lead to Russia sending rockets to kill us. So this prompted the start of the space program and the race to space. In 1958, the United States then founded NASA. At the same time, the USSR was sending missions to the moon, the Luna missions, and that's when we started looking at our 3 types of missions to have a manned mission to the moon. In 1961, Vostok 1 actually went into space from the Soviet Union. The first man to have a flight manned mission was Yuri Gagarin. It really did not qualify, though. At the time, Yuri Gagarin was supposed to come down with his spacecraft to the Earth. He didn't do that. It turns out that he parachuted from his spacecraft. The spacecraft crashed and he landed safely on the Earth. It was supposed to be the whole spaceship came down, or the spacecraft came down with the astronaut. So we're looking at first, really the United States was the first to do that. However, he went into space. So I say he gets credit uh, because at that time they were also sending up dogs. The dogs did not make it. The first dog in space was Laika, which was a mutt from Russia. And the Russian space agency said, "Oh yes, this dog made it into space, and we put it to sleep in space. So when it came back in, the heat wouldn't kill it." Unfortunately, that wasn't true. The dog Laika actually died in the capsule upon launch due to heat exhaustion and stress. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that was hidden from us. A lot of cosmonauts actually died um, for the Soviet Union trying to get into space. In 1962, President Kennedy makes his famous speech at Rice University. I always get chills and goosebumps every time I listen to this speech. I'm going to go ahead and provide a link for you on the website in the course. So if you want to stop and pause at this moment, you can go ahead and listen to the speech. If not, you can keep watching the video here and then go back later on and take a look at that speech. In 1966, the Soviet Union launches Luna 9 to the moon. It is the first spacecraft to soft land on the surface of the moon, and it did send back pictures of the surface. Surveyor 1 lands shortly after that, May 30th, 1966, It soft lands shortly after Luna 9 did. Now, in 1959 and 1963, this is where we have Project Mercury. The NASA develops 3 specific missions to get a man to the moon. The first is the Mercury missions. Second is Gemini missions, which is to have rendezvous in space. And then the third set of missions is the actual lunar landing, the Apollo missions. So the whole process was broken up into 3 separate missions. The Mercury missions were meant to get a man into space and get him into orbit. And then the Gemini missions were meant to have it rendezvous or have it have the service module match up with the lunar module and do a turnaround, and then have that lunar module actually land on the surface of the moon. And then come back up and rejoin with the service module. And then upon return, the command module releases from that and drops to the surface. Okay, there were 7 astronauts, the original 7, and this is what we call the Mercury 7. It was Malcolm Scott Carpenter, Leroy Gordon, Gordo Cooper Jr., John Herschel Glenn, which is John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Walter Marty, Wally Schirra, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton. Deke is actually later on pulled from the mission because he actually has a heart issue. So the first American in space is Alan Shepard on the Freedom 7. Notice the 7, that is to indicate the number of original astronauts. John Glenn was the first American to orbit in space on Friendship 7. The Gemini missions, again, were to subject humans and equipment to space flight in 2-week durations. They were to rendezvous, dock, and maneuver with orbiting space vehicles. They were to perform methods of re-entry and landing the spacecraft at a pre-selected landing site, and to perfect re-entry into the atmosphere and landing on a specific point on land. That did not happen. They figured that it was much easier to hit 70% ocean than 30% land. Okay, so there were actually scheduled 10 manned missions for the Gemini project. I know it's spelled Gemini, but they pronounced it Gemini. Okay, here is a picture of the building that they built in order to have these missions. Most of the space flights that I can think of went on the Saturn V-B rocket, and this thing was huge. The entire ensemble was built together in this building, and if you look at the NASA emblem, which we call the meatball, and the American flag, right in between those two, you'll see a gray rectangle. That's actually close to the size of the sliding doors. If you look on the other side of the building, you can actually see the opening. These sliding doors would slide up and down, and they would allow the entire space, the space rocket, to actually be brought out on a motorized platform. Okay, so in 1967, we start our manned missions. The first Apollo mission was actually supposed to be Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. These 3 men were supposed to be the first to go into space for the Apollo missions. It turns out that while they're in the space capsule running a routine test, they end up having a spark from an exposed wire cause the highly pressurized oxygen environment to explode, and unfortunately these 3 men were killed. It was labeled Apollo 1. They were going to redesignate the name of the mission, but the wives of the men were very upset with that, and so they continued to call it Apollo 1. So this was supposed to be the first mission, and most likely these 3 men, if they had survived, would probably have been the first 3 to walk on the moon. Apollo 11 does make that monumental journey on July 20th, 1969. The lunar module lands with the famous words, "The Eagle has landed." Uh, the first steps on the moon were taken by Neil Armstrong, followed by Buzz Aldrin. Here's a few interesting facts. Neil Armstrong was actually a pretty impressive pilot. Buzz Aldrin actually has his PhD in orbital mechanics, which was very interesting. So it was kind of neat, and they actually fought over who was going to go first. It was kind of unknown whether the commander or the pilot should be the first to walk on the moon. So the decision was made that Neil would be the first to take the step onto the moon, and Buzz Aldrin followed. The one that you don't hear much about is Michael Collins. Michael Collins was the third member of the crew, and the most important, in my opinion. Yeah, these two men had to get their lunar module landed on the surface and then get back up. But Michael Collins was the one that told them when they had to launch. And they had to rendezvous with the service and command module piloted by Michael Collins. And so if they didn't get to the module in time, they weren't going to get home. So Michael Collins stayed in the ship and waited for them to return and made sure that everything was operating appropriately. Okay, so again, the commander of the mission was Neil Armstrong, the lunar pilot was Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins was the command module pilot. The lunar module was called the Eagle. Here's a picture of the first step, Neil Armstrong putting his foot on the moon. Buzz Aldrin also was on the moon and actually learned how to skip, so to speak, in order to make it easy for the astronauts to walk on the surface. The command and service module for Apollo 11 were called the Columbia. The crew for Apollo 13, the reason we mention Apollo 13 is it was the greatest successful disaster in NASA's history. The three crew members of the Apollo 13 mission were James Lovell, John Swigert, and Fred Haise. And the three of them did not ever make it to the surface of the moon. They had an oxygen tank stir that caused a bit of an explosion, and they were losing fuel and oxygen. And so NASA here on the surface had to come up with very creative ways to bring these three men home. If you want to know some more history from different aspects, one of the most popular movies right now is the Hidden Figures movie, which goes into women of color and their influence in the space program. And then also you might want to look at Apollo 13. And also one of the series that I've really enjoyed is the From the Earth to the Moon. That has a lot of interesting information about the race to space and from the American perspective. Again, this mission was Houston, we've had a problem. It was the third mission to the moon. And again, it was the most successful disaster of NASA's history. Apollo 17 was the last mission to the moon. The American people kind of got tired after the first couple of missions. They were just like, okay, there it is. And we've already done it. So 1972 was the end of the manned missions to the moon. So let's talk about space exploration. Not only were we sending men to the moon, why not women? Well, that's another story of history too. But we were also still sending probes out to explore the planets in our solar system. So there's quite a few. Mariner is actually a series of probes. They were actually sent to multiple planets. So when you see Mariner, you might get confused. Try not to. There were Mariner missions that went to Venus, and then there were Mariner missions that went to Mars as well. Okay, so Mariner 2 did a Venus flyby. It came within 35,000 kilometers. It was a probe that was actually able to determine that there was a retrograde motion of Venus. And what that means is that Venus is actually upside down. Its axis is tilted by about 122 degrees. And so that makes it appear to rotate clockwise instead of counterclockwise. It was also able to determine that Venus has a predominantly CO2 atmosphere. Venera 7 was sent by the Soviet Union. It was actually the first spacecraft to land on the surface of Venus, which was really awesome. The probe survived about 23 minutes. It was able to collect data about the atmosphere and the temperature, and that's when they found out why the United States probe, which was sent several days prior to this, didn't stop working and didn't send data anymore. And that's because the pressure was so high and the temperature was about 750 Kelvin, which is high enough in order to melt lead. So basically, the probe started melting and stopped sending data. Pioneer 10 was sent in 1972 to Jupiter. There's actually Pioneer 10 and Pioneer 11. It was over 7 billion miles away now. The mission ended in 1997. However, a weak signal, believe it or not, continues to be tracked today. This probe is heading towards the constellation Taurus, which looks like a V in the sky. It first traveled, it's the actual first probe to travel through the asteroid belt, and it was the first to make direct observations of a close-up of Jupiter. This plaque was also included on the Pioneer 10 spacecraft. You'll notice a naked man and a naked woman. These two pictures were actually representing Carl Sagan and his wife. His wife was actually the one that created the plaque for this mission. They have a binary code, they show the star system, they show the probe, and they show how the probe is moving through space. They also show a water molecule to show that we're made predominantly of water. Pioneer 11 from 1973 was sent to study Jupiter and Saturn. The mission ended in 1995 when the last transmission was received, and this probe is heading towards the constellation Aquila. Mariner 10 actually came within 10,000 kilometers of the Mercury surface, and it passed by Mercury 3 times. Up until just recently, this was the only probe to actually take pictures of Mercury, and up until recently, these pictures were the only pictures of Mercury. Still, 45% was explored, but 55% was unexplored. We have much better pictures now from the probes that were just recently sent. Viking 1 and 2 were sent to explore Mars. Viking 1 landed on the surface of Mars on July 20th, 1976. Both probes had successful flights. The Viking 1 operated until 1982. Viking 2 orbited and stopped working around 1980. It was using more fuel from maintaining its orbit in space than the one on the surface. Mercury 1's main mission was to take soil samples and to collect data to see if there's actually life on Mars. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 were sent to look at the outer planets. Again, they went through the asteroid belt. So in 1977, we have Voyager 1. It did a close flyby of Jupiter and Saturn. It's approximately 40 astronomical units from the sun. Voyager 2 actually did a flyby of all 4 Jovian planets, which means it went by Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. it is now approximately 31 astronomical units away. So now let's talk about the space transport part of space exploration. These probes that we send out, and the satellites that we sent out, and even the International Space Station, were all put in space by the Space Shuttle program. And so Columbia was the first space shuttle launched. There were 4 other orbiters. There's Atlantis, Challenger, Discovery, and Endeavour. They flew over 100 successful launches since 1981. They are no longer in service. So here is Columbia, the first space shuttle launch. It has 3 fuel tanks. The fuel tanks come off as this goes into space. And I don't know if you can see from the picture, but this tower actually rotates. So you rotate it in front of it, and that's where the astronauts come in and get on to the space shuttle. And then you rotate it out in order to launch. They also dump water directly underneath it. And there's 2 reasons for this. One is for the heat, but also the main reason actually is from the sound waves. The sound that's given off by the rockets is so strong that it could actually shatter your eardrum from quite a large distance away. The water helps to absorb those sound waves so that we don't have damage to things around in that area, because these sound waves can go far. In fact, when the Antares rocket exploded right after takeoff from Wallops Flight Facility, people from half a mile away were actually knocked down from that blast. Okay, we also have the probe called Magellan. Magellan was sent to Venus. It mapped the entire surface of Venus. It had 10 times better resolution than any of the previous pictures. And it was able to help us to change our theories about the formation of Venus and the formation of our solar system. Galileo was launched in 1989. It studied the moon Io and took pictures of volcanoes. That's how we knew there were volcanoes on Io. The magnetic field of Jupiter actually shut down the computers on the probe, and so the scientists actually reprogrammed the probe in order to stay operating during that time that it was going by Jupiter in order to collect more data. And what's interesting is that it continued working well after that. They were actually able to study Europa. They actually were able to determine that there's probably oceans. Well, they actually did determine there's oceans underneath the icy surface of Europa, which could possibly have life. Because of that, they had to figure out a way to get rid of the Galilean probe. They didn't scrub it before sending it into space, which meant that it had contaminants from the Earth. So what they had to do was they actually crashed this into the surface of Jupiter so that it would not be able to crash into Europa and maybe destroy any life that might be there. It was sent to the surface of Jupiter on September 21st. The Mars Global Surveyor was a probe it's still orbiting Mars. It may not be collecting data though, or it may. Scanning the surface with cameras and charting the landscape for future missions that we've sent there. On July 4th, the Pathfinder parachuted an instrumentation package to the Martian surface. The side panels opened up, and a 6-wheeled mini rover called Sojourner wheeled onto the surface for the very first time. This is the first time we actually have a mobile vehicle on the surface of Mars. Sojourner roams for about 3 months. It collected atmospheric and geologic samples. Cassini-Huygens in 2004 actually did a study of Saturn and Titan. Actually, there was a Huygens probe, as you see, Cassini-Huygens. The Huygens probe was actually dropped through the atmosphere of Titan, and they videotaped or took a video of the descent of this probe onto the surface. We were actually able to determine that there's actually methane oceans on the surface of Titan, which could again possibly have life. The Mars Exploration Rover landed in January of 2003. It released two separate rovers, which I think only one is currently operating, and it was Opportunity and Spirit. In 1986, the Challenger exploded 73 seconds into the launch due to an O-ring issue. That was our first space shuttle disaster. The second one was Columbia exploding in 2003. It disintegrated over Texas during re-entry because some of those heat shield panels had fallen off when it was launched. And upon re-entry, the atmosphere burned through and the wing melted off. Here you can see again the platform, which is where the space shuttles were launched from. These platforms are still there, but they no longer launch the space shuttles. Okay, Messenger was sent in 2011. It did 3 flybys of the surface of Mercury. This is the most recent data we have. And now we're going to talk about contributions of the space program. Here's a reference link. So if you want to go ahead and take a look, I'm not sure if it works still. This is quite an old set of lecture notes. So it could be that this link no longer operates, but I'll make sure that I have an active link on the website. Okay, so let's talk about contributions. The race to space actually contributed to the increase in science and math education. There have been many contributions from NASA since that point in the 1960s. I'm actually a product of the space race. When I was a little kid, all of the kids in the neighborhood, my dad brought us all into the living room. We sat in front of the TV and we actually watched the first launch, the Apollo 11 launch, which landed a man on the moon. Because of that, all of my friends that I know of, we all went into science type careers. My friend Steve has his physics degree and then also a chemical engineering degree on top of that. I went on for a physics degree or a technical degree and on for my PhD. And really, I mean, before when I was little, kids older than me were playing cowboys and Indians. We started playing NASA and space race. I mean, we would pretend we were astronauts and launching into space. So there was a big, huge push for us to do more in science and math. I don't so much see that in the 90s and the early 2000s. I'm starting to see a big, huge push now for STEM, which is the same push we had before. We're running out of engineers. They're all retiring, and only about 1% of all of those that go into STEM careers actually make it through into engineering. So there's a huge, huge shortage for engineers to replace those retiring. So let's talk about contributions in your own home. Satellite and satellite TV all come from the space program. Cordless tools were developed for the Apollo missions on the moon. Smoke detectors, after that big fire, they started looking for ways to detect smoke. Water filter systems and insulation. All of those things were developed for the space program in order to put a man on the moon. These are some interesting things. Laser heart surgery. Basically, they're able to go in there with laser light and they put chemicals in your body, and the laser light causes them to become toxic. So you can actually pinpoint where you're going to make those chemicals be toxic, and that could be right in the middle of a tumor. LEDs, light emitting diodes, comes from this. New arms and legs, body imaging, digital mammography, all of this comes from the technology that was developed for the space program. Sorry, it cut me off a little bit. Some other things that you can also think about are Velcro. Velcro came about from the space program. I'm telling you something. My kids would never have been able to wear shoes. They'd be barefoot until the time they were 10 if it wasn't for Velcro. Tang. Yep. You, no Tang without the space program. Freeze-dried foods, keeping our foods safe over long periods of time. That all came about from the space program. There's so many things that we get back from our research dollars, and it's kind of amazing. But it also creates jobs too. So not only are we getting something back for our money, but we're also getting people jobs to be able to pay for their children, for their homes, for their food. And who wouldn't want to work for NASA? I do. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and email me.